In the late 1970s, the Mi-24 became the main attack helicopter of the Soviet armed forces. New helicopters kept on coming. Mi-24 export versions were being delivered abroad, not just to Warsaw Pact countries, but also to the developing world. And actually, it was the export versions of the Mi-24 that had the first real trial in combat. That happened in 1977 during the Ethiopian-Somali War in the Ogaden. Since then, Mi-24s have been in armed conflict in many different parts of the world. And today, the helicopter still maintains its reputation as one of the most reliable and powerful combat helicopters in the world.
Вся группа на курс 120. На курс 120 вся группа. 300 до 600 разведите. Второй 900.
Mi-24, Film 2, the story continues. In the early 70s, the anti-tank guided missile system was developing rapidly. It quickly became a very powerful weapon. Combat helicopters with these missile systems posed a serious threat to tank units. Several accounts claim that for each downed helicopter, there were 17 destroyed tanks. It also started to become clear that only a helicopter could adequately fight another helicopter. Experimentally, they started carrying air-to-air missiles. During test flying, helicopters seemed to be the only aircraft that could fly low enough and use ground features to hide from their prey. So, training for Mi-24 pilots now included close aerial combat and very low flying. In the late 70s, an Army Aviation Center for combat training was established at Torosok. Pilots trained there in the new operational procedures for attack helicopter combat flying, especially at low altitudes. Combat tactics were developed as well as new ground-air cooperation schemes. After they completed the course, pilots could test their new skills back in their combat units. And in those regiments, the pilots were busy improving their skills. Some of these units were based in territories friendly to the Soviet Union. The biggest helicopter unit was actually in the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. The designers worked closely with the military to improve the Mi-24. Many different versions were designed. Some of them went on into mass production, others got no further than the prototype stage. In the second half of the 70s, more firepower was the cry. The answer? Fit the helicopter with cannon. The new version was designated Mi-24P. The Gryazov-Shepunova 30mm twin-barrel aircraft cannon was chosen, the same as in the Su-25 attack aircraft. But the cannon was so heavy and the recoil force so strong that it couldn't be fitted on a steerable mount. So it had to be fixed on the right side. But then the muzzle was alongside the weapons operator's cockpit. When the cannon was firing, the shock waves adversely affected not just the operator, but also the sighting system, and in fact, the whole aircraft trim. Mil Design Bureau engineers sought out the man who designed the gun, Vasily Gryazov. He approached the problem sympathetically. Okay, he said, I'll make it 1 meter longer, but no more than 1 meter. So the extended barrel GSH-30K cannon came about. But it wasn't enough. The muzzle was still alongside the fuselage. We decided to make extra inserts to extend the muzzle beyond the helicopter fuselage. And at the same time, because the barrels were now too long and the cannon could flex a bit, we had to design additional supports. Now, at last, the cannon was stable. All this development had taken almost 6 years, but the result was a very solid helicopter with a powerful and reliable weapon. The Mi-24P went into mass production in 1981. In the early 80s, the Soviet war against the Mujahideen in Afghanistan had started. Several Mi-24 versions took part. It became a tough test. They had to fight day and night in conditions of heat and high humidity. Once Soviet troops were openly involved in the war, it became obvious that many military operations on the ground were impossible without the support of combat helicopters. Soviet helicopter bases in Afghanistan were on the increase. It took some time for pilots to adapt to the harsh climate of the Afghanistan highlands. Most of the crews had no experience in mountain flying.
Вот здесь, конечно, не все было просто.
It wasn't simple, of course. Our squadron was based at Gazna, 2,200 meters above sea level. At those altitudes, when the helicopters were fully loaded with ammunition, they had to take off and land like fixed-wing aircraft, especially in summer, when the high temperatures meant that they were even more short of power. While the military pilots tried to adapt to these new conditions, the Flight Research Institute staff flew many tests to improve the flying techniques for the helicopters in mountainous areas. With the Mi-24 especially, they practiced takeoff and landing using only the front wheel. Sometimes combat pilots practiced takeoffs off the front wheel. Our job as scientists meant that we had to decide the limits on such maneuvers, and we also had to issue recommendations to the combat pilots. We conducted our tests in Lenina Khan, now it's called Gyumri. It was near the Turkish border. The climate was pretty similar to Afghanistan. We needed hot weather, as you know. We'd load the helicopters with 2 or 3 tons extra to see how that would affect the takeoff. At first, even for me, it was bizarre to raise the tail of the helicopter first. I had this feeling that the rotor blades would hit the ground. See, the pilot's seat, the pilot is behind the weapons operator who's in the front cockpit, and you're looking at the ground through that upper blister. And when you're flying that maneuver, you push the cyclic stick well over the neutral position, right to the instrument panel. Then the tail of the helicopter lifts up, you add some power, and the helicopter starts to run. It runs 25 to 30 meters, and then suddenly you're off. During the tests, the engineers measured the running distance because they needed to know which was better, a short run or a long run. The Mi-24 became one of the symbols of the 1980s Afghan war. The helicopter's predatory silhouette was widely recognized by everyone involved in these operations. And it was in Afghanistan that cooperation between the Mi-24 and the Mi-8 helicopters came close to perfection. During the Afghan war, Soviet soldiers often compared our helicopters to angels coming down from heaven. The helicopters rescued the wounded, they helped the troops fight their way out when they were surrounded. When the Mi-8s were on their missions, the Mi-24s would cover them. So, when Mi-8s landed troops, the Mi-24s would be there to help, to give the troops fire cover. That's how the Mi-8 and the Mi-24 worked together. That's how they interacted. Their cooperation was honed and developed as combat missions progressed. Apart from the covering landing operations, the combat helicopters escorted convoys, they searched out enemy convoys, and they destroyed Mujahideen military bases. The tactics varied according to circumstances. To start with, the Mujahideen only had heavy machine guns and small arms. To avoid that, the helicopters flew at high altitude. But when portable heat-seeking missile systems appeared, it was safer to fly at very low level. Pilots had to maneuver hard to dodge the ground fire. Sometimes they pushed their helicopters way over the limits, but often that was their only chance. The Mil Design Bureau engineers often went to Afghanistan to learn from first-hand experience. It helped them solve problems quickly, to make their beloved Mil helicopters better.
Опыт боевых действий привел к тому, что
Combat operational experience helped us develop a major upgrade of the helicopter. We had to do it in some haste because the Afghan war wouldn't wait, you know. When we were sent there, the idea was to increase the helicopter's survivability and combat capabilities. So, our combat experience helped us make improvements. At the end of the war, the helicopters were much stronger, much better than they had been at the start. Combat survivability and combat effectiveness were significantly improved. The engines had to be protected from sand and dust with filters on the air intakes. Countermeasures against portable heat-seeking missile systems were developed. Amongst them, decoy heat flares with automatic dispensers, infrared jammers, and suppression systems for infrared in the turbine exhausts. Helicopters with the anti-missile systems were on station to protect transport aircraft as they landed and took off. We'd be tasked as the plane approached the airfield. We'd take off and loiter near the outer marker. When the transport plane got below 1,000 meters, we'd go to the inner marker. And then, when the plane was getting near the runway, we'd fly right next to it. In Kabul, our main object was the safe arrival of the planes, protecting their landings and takeoffs. We'd fly right next to them. We were really flying as a tight formation pair. I'd say we formed a sort of protection shield for the aircraft. As soon as it got to the inner marker area, we covered it from both sides. The same thing during takeoffs. We'd line up, then make a circle and escort the plane until it was out of our zone. It was all a bit bizarre sometimes. The plane would land safely, but the helicopters would be badly damaged by enemy fire. The great combat survivability of the Mi-24 often helped pilots land safely despite heavy damage. We have a lot to thank the helicopter's designers for. They made crew protection a high priority. They made sure the most important elements of the cockpit and the fuselage were heavily armored. And that helped us psychologically because we knew we were protected from machine gun or rifle fire. Well, not 100% protected perhaps, but say 70 or 80% of the helicopter fuselage was protected. During combat missions, an attack helicopter would be the first to feel the effect of enemy fire. That's why they needed that extra protection. The designers tried armored glass inside the cockpits to shield pilots from sideways fire, but it so reduced the available space that it had to be dropped. Instead, the pilots wore a heavy armored helmet. They also had an assault rifle with ammunition and an emergency kit. The total weight of their personal gear was sometimes as much as 10 kilos. The intensity of combat missions was on the increase. Some pilots did several missions a day. During the Afghan war, most pilots and technicians were regularly rotated. Usually, helicopter pilots had tours of 1 year in Afghanistan. But some pilots stayed put for the whole war from beginning to end. And according to military figures, 50% of Soviet military helicopter pilots flew in the war. It wasn't just pilots that won the war. I reckon everyone who was sent there could be called a soldier. Even the technicians who stayed on the ground and didn't face the enemy. I consider them soldiers too. Besides all their work repairing battle damage, they also have to prepare the helicopters for flight. They'd carry belts of cartridges, they'd load missiles, and all the other vital stuff. It was all time-consuming effort. Yes, I would call them soldiers too, of course. Onboard technicians were considered crew members. They played an important role in combat missions.
Я скажу, это хозяин.
I would say they were the masters of the helicopters. They were in charge of the helicopter's condition. You're the person, all the in-flight failures will be your fault. And when the helicopter takes off, that's where your responsibility starts. You're responsible to the helicopter's crew, including yourself. Onboard technicians often became gunners. They fired the manually operated machine guns mounted in the windows of the cargo compartment. When we flew as cover for the Mi-8 missions, the onboard technicians had to operate the machine guns. That was very important, you see. But when the Mujahideen began using portable heat-seeking missiles, the Mi-24 crews began flying combat missions without the onboard technicians. High serviceability rates and the similar design of the Mi-8 and the Mi-24 made maintenance and repair easier. Most battle-damaged helicopters were brought back online by the ground technicians at the airfields. If a helicopter got damaged in combat, the technicians would repair it, and next morning it would be ready for its next mission. The technicians were magicians. They'd work day and night, so the helicopter was ready by 3 in the morning. Most of our combat missions started early in the morning, and normally we had to wake up at 3. We had great faith in the technicians. When we approached our helicopter before flight, we could see it was ready for a fight. It was ready to help us perform our combat mission. The helicopters were specially designed to be repaired in the field, sometimes even where they'd made an emergency landing. The helicopter's combat efficiency was improved by the arrival of S-8 rockets. Laser rangefinders, night vision goggles, night aiming systems, they all became part of the onboard equipment. With all these Afghan war improvements, the Mi-24 had become an incomparable combat helicopter. Much useful experience was gained in the severe climatic conditions, and that later helped make the helicopter even better. All that experience from the Afghan war helped us to build the next generation helicopter, the Mi-28. We updated and improved the Mi-24 constantly. We developed new equipment and armament. And later, that all came good on the Mi-28. It is true when they say war pushes technology forward. It was because of the Afghan war experience that the Mi-28 became such an extraordinary helicopter. But the price of this experience was very high. 127 Mi-24 helicopters were shot down during the Afghan war. In many cases, that meant the death of the crew. A year after Soviet troops withdrew from Afghanistan, a new organization called Army Aviation was incorporated in the USSR. It was a direct result of the war. The military had realized the importance of liaison between helicopter units and ground troops. Many Air Force helicopter units became part of Soviet Army Aviation. First Commander-in-Chief of Army Aviation was Afghan war hero Colonel General Vitaly Pavlov. Some of the pilots who fought in Afghanistan were involved in the recovery from the Chernobyl accident. Back in the 70s, an airborne chemical laboratory had been created based on the Mi-24. It had been intended for collecting samples from contaminated areas during nuclear war. The sampling instrumentation was in the cargo compartment. To get soil samples, there were special little excavators attached to the pylons. These special Mi-24 helicopters helped to make a map of the radioactive contamination around the Chernobyl plant. In the early 1990s, the Soviet Union collapsed. Like many other industries, the Russian aviation industry went into deep crisis. New helicopters to replace the existing attack helicopters were cancelled. Mass production came to a halt. There were some Mi-24 helicopters left in the former republics of the Soviet Union. Others were sold to third world countries where they provided exemplary service. But Russia was the biggest operator of the various different versions of the Mi-24. After the Cold War was over, the Russian aviation industry suddenly found it could demonstrate its aircraft worldwide. Aviation bureaus and companies flocked to international air shows. International agreements meant that missiles had to be destroyed, often in mid-air. Russian aircraft are great showstoppers, but what really gets people's attention is an aerobatic team. In the early 90s, the Russian Air Force Strigi, the Russian Knights and Flying Hussars broke onto the world stage. The helicopter pilots decided to organize their own aerobatic team. At the Torozhok Aviation Combat Training Center, the Berkuts team, the Golden Eagles, was established.
Знаете, все равно все пришло оттуда, из боевой подготовки.
It all stemmed from our combat training, you know. The team got going in 1992. By that time, we were all well aware of what our Mi-24s were capable of. We were experienced, we could fly both solo and group missions. We were comfortable with air combat. We each knew what the other could do with the helicopter. There was the odd difficulty, of course, but that didn't stop us. We had good support from above. The head of the center, Mr. Vorobyev, was very helpful, and the Army Aviation Chief, Commander Vitaly Pavlov, gave his approval too. But most of all, it was our desire to show that we could do it. The Berkuts helicopter team starred in lots of international air shows around the world. In 2012, they celebrated their 20th anniversary. Today, the team consists of two sections. One flies the latest Mi-28 helicopters, and the other flies the Mi-24 and its successor, the Mi-35. One of the exhibits at the Torozhok Center Museum is a unique Mi-24 helicopter. In 1992, an all-female crew, Commander Galina Rostohuyeva, navigator Lyudmila Polyanskia, and co-pilot Galina Koshkina flew it all the way from Moscow to Miami, a distance of 25,000 kilometers. The flight was timed to coincide with the 500th anniversary of the discovery of America and the 50th anniversary of the Second World War Lend-Lease program. They'd been preparing for the flight for nearly 2 years. There was lots of paperwork to do, including the complicated approvals for the route. And they also had to adapt the helicopter and indeed brush up on their flying skills. They did their training at the Torozhok Center, where the Army Aviation Chief Commander Vitaly Pavlov was in charge. The first person we went to see was Yevgeny Ignatov, the chief of the flight service. He didn't know how to cope with these two little women, and he was worried about our age. I was 56, and my colleague was 54. What shall I do with these pensioners, he thought. First of all, I was worried about their age, and it had been a long time since they flew the helicopter, but they really loved flying. They were very brave to take on this flight. I don't mean just the length of the route and all that stuff. It was just difficult to make such a big decision. Well, he was wary of us. But he assigned us to a remarkable instructor, Vyacheslav Tsimbalova, who had fought in Afghanistan. Vyacheslav worked with us, especially me, day and night, while I practiced my flying skills in the simulator. When I was ready, I got my clearance. Then Yevgeny Ignatova also tested us. On the first day of the tests, they'd planned 4 hours in the Mi-24 for me. But we were getting on very well with him, and when I'd finished the flying tests, it all became clear. After that first day, we were obviously going to make our flight to Miami. That training was just great. They were making very intensive preparations for this flight, of course, and they wanted to practice every possible situation that they might find themselves in on the flight. One day they called the chief commander and said, "We've practiced taking off with only one engine working and at normal takeoff weight. But on the flight, we've got 4 extra fuel tanks. So we need to put extra weight and do takeoffs at those weights." Pavlov said to me, "She won't let you alone. Just let her fly with her 4 fuel tanks." So we started with empty tanks and then with full tanks. That was okay. Then Galina said, "They only let us land at the airfield here, but we're going to fly over Chukotka, so we need to practice landing on a landing site." Pavlov said, "Well, you know her. Let's train her on a landing site." These women had decided to make this extraordinary flight. They just loved flying and they trusted the helicopter. They started from Moscow on the 1st of September. It didn't all go perfectly, but eventually this unprecedented long-distance flight of an Mi-24 combat helicopter and its escorting Mi-17 was complete. They landed successfully at their final destination in Miami. In the second half of the 1990s, the Mi-24 embarked on a new lease of life. Russian defense companies were resuming work on projects that had been cancelled in the early 90s. New aircraft, new equipment, new armaments were being designed. The Mil Design Bureau offered updates for its helicopters, many of which were still in use all over the world. The Rostov helicopter plant came to the fore in these developments. We really believed in the Mi-24, and we were still the leading manufacturer for it. We hadn't sold off our equipment, we'd kept our documentation, and we hadn't lost our people. And that's why we're still the leading helicopter maker in Russia. We were doing modernization work on the Mi-24, and also repairs. The Mi-24 kept us alive. As I see it, the key factors in the Mi-24 success are low-cost maintenance, serviceability, and reliability. New helicopter developments led to more modifications to the Mi-24. The Mi-24 VP with the double-barreled GSH-23 trainable cannon was used to develop one such mod. Only 25 of them had been built in the Soviet Union. At the Rostov helicopter plant, several Mi-24 VP got the same rotor system as the Mi-28 combat helicopter. And that meant fiberglass blades, titanium main rotor hub, and X-shaped tail rotor. They also got new high-altitude engines, and to reduce the total weight, a fixed undercarriage replaced the retractable version. The wing was shortened. The revamped helicopter made its maiden flight in March 1999. Gennady Ananyov was the test pilot. The results of all these changes were better range and improved high temperature and high altitude performance. The weight of the helicopter had been reduced, and at the same time it was more maneuverable and better able to survive in combat. In 2004, the Russian Armed Forces ordered several of these updated Mi-24P combat helicopters from the Rostov helicopter plant. The new model included a laser rangefinder and a thermal imaging target seeker. That gave it a night fighting capability. From then on, the manufacturers offered different options for the Mi-24 at different prices. The customer could choose between different combinations of helicopter equipment. And as well as upgrading existing helicopters, the plant resumed mass production of new ones. Today, customers from Latin America, Asia, and Africa are all interested in helicopters from the Rostov plant. The plant's traditional main customer has been the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation and previously of the Soviet Union. And the ministry is still the main customer. Now the Russian Air Force has another new version of the good old Mi-24. This one is a new generation helicopter, the Mi-35M. Multi-purpose attack helicopter Mi-35M. Main rotor diameter 17.2 meters. Fuselage length 17.5 meters. Maximum takeoff weight 11,500 kilograms. Maximum loading capacity 2,400 kilograms. Power plant, 2 gas turbine engines, 2,400 horsepower each. Crew, 3. Maximum speed, 310 kilometers an hour. Range, 435 kilometers. Armament, twin-barrel GSH 23L cannon. Rockets, suspension pods, anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles. The fiberglass rotor with its titanium hub and a new aerodynamic profile, as well as the X-shaped tail rotor, all increase performance and also combat survivability. The new instrumentation system has LCD screens, and the helicopter is day and night capable. There's also a night vision goggle system. There's a completely new weapon aiming and computer system with gyro-stabilized electro-optics that include the laser rangefinder and thermal imager. The helicopter has a protection system against missiles. To cope with rough landings, the fixed landing gear has extra energy-absorbing capacity, and that protects the aircraft's structure against abnormal loads. The shorter wing is equipped with a built-in hoist for the heavier weapons, and that also makes maintenance easier. The armament system has commonality with other Russian combat helicopters. Beside cannon and rockets, and depending on its mission, the helicopter can carry anti-tank or anti-aircraft missiles on 16 hard points. All of these developments expand the helicopter's all-round capabilities. The Mi-35M is the true embodiment of a modern combat helicopter.
То есть мы на сегодня имеем достаточно надежное.
So today we have a reliable and very effective helicopter, able to conduct missions by day and by night.
Более того,
But that's not just about flying at night, which most helicopters can do. The Mi-35M finds the target, identifies it, aims and fires at it day or night. The armament system automatically chooses the type of weapon to suit the target. And another part of the system helps the pilot detect any approaching threats and find the best solution to deal with them. We've waited a long time for this helicopter, and finally it's here. We've got what we wanted. New engine, new rotor and flight systems, and a new armament system. And the good old airframe can still please the pilot. The multi-role Mi-35M is what the Russian Air Force has long wanted. It takes the best parts of its predecessors: reliability, easy maintenance, and high combat survivability. Both the new Mi-35M and the Mi-24, in various stages of modification, continue to serve the Russian Air Force. The city of Koranovsk, the 393rd Army Aviation Air Base. The base goes back to 1942, when combat pilots defended the southern borders of the Soviet Union with IL-2 attack aircraft. After the war, attack aircraft gradually started giving way to helicopters. Since the 1970s, the airbase has been mainly concerned with the Mi-24. The Mi-24s became operational in a helicopter regiment, which was then based in the town of Brody in the Carpathians. Much useful experience has been gained since then. There are still a few Mi-24Ps in service at the base. They're used as combat and training helicopters. The good maneuverability of the Mi-24 helps pilots to master helicopter combat handling. We've been training student pilots for several years. These are in their 5th year from the Sizran High Military Aviation School. This year, 6 students have trained here, and I tell you, there's one who's mastered the Mi-24. He'll be able to master all other types of helicopters. Why? Because when you fly the Mi-24, you can feel its gravitas. It won't forgive you for mistakes like the Mi-28. You need accurate technique and care and concentration. When you master the Mi-24, with respect, but with a firm approach, understanding what you can and can't do, only then can you call yourself a real helicopter pilot, able to fly any other helicopter. The Mi-24 still commands respect amongst military pilots. Time and battles have proved the Mi-24 a great helicopter. It's served in many wars, including the big one in Afghanistan. And I may say that when you start flying it, you don't worry about something going wrong or any abnormal behavior. I think any Army aviation pilot will tell you that the Mi-24 is the helicopter you trust. It's like your fellow soldier. This combat helicopter, I've been flying it more than 20 years, is a great friend of mine. I'm not exaggerating, it's a fantastic old friend. The Mi-24 has made an invaluable contribution in the development of Army aviation. The proof of that can be found in Afghanistan, in the North Caucasus, and in peace support missions in other countries. How do I value the Mi-24? I give it full marks, the highest accolade. The Mi-24's got lots of nicknames. People call it Stripey. The NATO classification reporting name is Hind. But most people call it the Crocodile. It's a good name for a formidable predator machine. Because crocodiles are some of the most ancient, ferocious, and merciless predators on Earth. The Mi-24 symbolizes the whole era of the Russian helicopter industry. It's more than 40 years since it made its maiden flight, and in that time, it's become one of the best combat helicopters in the world. It became an inspiration for many modern combat helicopters in Russia and elsewhere. The Mi-24 has played its part in more than 30 armed conflicts, and it still retains its great fighting capabilities. It's still operating in many countries around the world. The legend that is the amazing Mi-24 lives on.